Hey everyone, it's Drayton from Scale Trains, and I'm here today to share the latest run of Rivet Counter N-Scale EMD SD40-2s. The details on these things are amazing, so stay tuned. So this video is long overdue. We've gotten a lot of requests from our customers asking us to share more about these exquisite models, and I tell you what, I'll be the first to admit that I'm an HO scale guy through and through. But after taking one of these locomotives out of the box last week, the detail, the sound, it just absolutely blew me away. So much so, and I'm not just saying this because I work here, I really am considering starting my own N-scale layout at home, partially because my space is limited. But also, you know, the thing for me personally as a modeler that has always kind of swayed me more to HO scale is that HO just always came with more detail, especially railroad, road number, and era specific detail. But now that I've seen these EMD SD40-2s, one of my favorite locomotives of all time, I am really considering ordering some. So today we're going to walk through each road name and paint scheme, kind of give you a little bit of history about each of them and also talk about the unique details. So let's start on the right. We're going to first begin talking about Union Pacific. So Union Pacific began ordering EMD SD40-2s in 1972, and their first orders, there really wasn't anything special about them. But over time, Union Pacific realized that, hey, we need to make some modifications to our SD40-2s to get the best out of them. And, you know, EMD already set them up with a fantastic locomotive, 3,000 horsepower, the Dash 2 system, so very easy to maintain. And if you ever had an issue, you could just swap out those electrical cards and you were ready to go. But Union Pacific had their own ideas, and they wanted some SD40-2s to run along with the Centennials. And so one of their solutions was to re-gear some of the SD40-2s for 79 miles per hour, which is incredible to think about. You know, an SD40-2, I can't really imagine going much more than 70, but UP wanted to see them at 79 miles per hour. So they began selecting certain road numbers in the 8000 series and also the 3000 series if there were any vacant slots, and they re-geared them. They did some electrical upgrades. And initially, one of the main reasons they decided to do this was they were looking at doing SD40-2Bs, but they came up with this idea of, hey, let's take existing locomotives, upgrade them so that they can run faster, and we'll just add them to consists, behind the Centennials. Over time, Union Pacific began using them outside of consists with the Centennials, so you could actually see, pairs of these locomotives or even trios of them running out in Utah and Nevada and California. But in the 80s, Union Pacific realized, these special modifications, they are useful, but at the same time, we need a more uniformed fleet. They worked for what they were good for. And by the mid-80s, Union Pacific started to kind of phase them out and go back to the original gearing. But, the locomotives that we're offering in this run are from the last 25 Fast 40s, as they were called. So these locomotives were rebuilt in the late 70s and ran in this configuration, I want to say, through the mid-80s, around 1987. And they, of course, remained on the Union Pacific roster, and as Union Pacific grew and acquired more companies in the 80s and 90s, the SD40-2s were renumbered. A lot of them were renumbered and reconfigured. So, but if you're a 70s and 80s Union Pacific modeler, these are an absolute must-have. Of course, you have the railroad road number and era specific detail, the non-operating beacon up top. You've got non-operating class lights. The lighting features on these locomotives are incredible. Of course, there are limitations in N-scale. So, the beacon, we couldn't get operational because of cost, and same thing with the class lights. But the headlights and illuminated number boards, they are really bright. They have that white color to them. So you've got that realistic glow, especially at night. And I'm really impressed, like I said, as an HO guy, seeing these locomotives in the dark. They look great. Moving along, we're going to take a look at Burlington Northern. Now, Burlington Northern, they ordered more SD40-2s than any other railroad. they were known for trios of SD40-2s really throughout the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s. And most of these locomotives ended up on the BNSF roster. They were repainted, and some of them even still wear the original Cascade green color, which I think is really cool. You got the same thing on the BN. You've got the non-operating beacon, your class lights, your LED illuminated headlight, and number boards, directional LED lighting. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to mention on the Union Pacific is that these locomotives have tread plate detail, which I think is really cool because for many years in N-scale, that was just one detail that was so small, it was really hard to replicate. One of the cool things, too, about our SD40-2s is that the printing and the lettering is visible with magnification. So one of the cool things about Burlington Northern is they actually had maintenance bases for their SD40-2. So if you look on some of these N-scale models, one of the road numbers that we have in this run doesn't have a maintenance base, so you can add your own. I don't know if that particular number, not being a BN modeler, ever had a maintenance base, but the ones that did, there's multiple maintenance bases to choose from. And right under the cab, by where the nose is where that maintenance base would be. That detail is included. Of course, you got all your warning labels, and they just look great. They sound great, too. That's one of the things that impresses me most about these locomotives. All right, so now that we've talked about our western roads, we're going to move on to the railroads east of the Mississippi River. And our first one that we're going to talk about is chassis system. And let me tell you, these locomotives are the cat's meow. One of the things that I think is incredible about our Rivet counter SD40-2s is that the horns on these locomotives are railroad specific. So, chassis system was known for the K5LA air horn, and they just sounded beautiful echoing through the mountains in West Virginia. And that's really why these horns have become one of the most popular horns among the railfan community today. And of course, we added that detail. It's really small, but you can see it. And if you get that magnifying glass, as I mentioned before, you can really make out the detail. Of course, you've got that beautiful, colorful chassis paint scheme. And one of the neat things about the chassis paint scheme was really around that time period, railroading was really drab. You had Penn Central, and a lot of these railroads just had these really blah paint schemes. But when chassis system was created, the new company, they wanted to make a real big impact. And of course, you got the chassis cat on there. And of course, the average person who isn't into railroads, who doesn't work in the railroad industry, they'd see that cat logo and it would really catch their attention. And that's exactly what these N-scale models do. Of course, these were delivered in the 70s, but through the 80s, they still wore the chassis system paint scheme. And some of these units, for a long time, even into the early 90s under CSX, they were relettered and had patching on them. But, that would be a very easy kit bashing job that you could do. You could re-decal these, and I'm sure in the future we'll offer the CSX patched versions, which I'm really excited about. So moving along from chassis system, we're going to go and look at CSX. And me being a modern modeler myself, I really like the CSX SD40-3s. And you might be wondering, what is the Dash 3? Well, the Dash 3 is the latest evolution in EMD's electrical card system. And essentially it's, upgraded electronics so the locomotives and the computer systems inside run better and more efficiently. And a lot of railroads are switching to the Dash 3 systems. And CSX was one of the first Class 1 railroads to do it. In the early 2010s, they were looking for alternatives to motive power because the Tier 4 emissions deadline was creeping up on them. And if CSX wanted new locomotives, they were going to have to invest about $5 million per locomotive from General Electric. And that was a really steep price tag. So they went back to the drawing board and they were trying to figure out, okay, what can we do with existing equipment to be more fuel efficient, to cut down on emissions without having to spend $5 or $6 million on a brand new locomotive. And so the solution was the SD40-3. CSX rebuilt their first 50 units in Huntington, West Virginia with an NRE designed cab. They featured a new air dryers, and they also had upgraded electronics in the cab, as mentioned before. They had climate control, so HVAC systems, which was a great upgrade on the SD40-2s. They didn't have air conditioning from the factory, so on those hot summer days in southern Georgia on CSX, the new air-conditioned cabs really came in handy. And one of the things that I think is really cool is the air start. So the air start feature is really neat. We use Loc Sound 5 DCC and sound decoders in our models. And just like the HO scale version, it's a delayed start. So you'll hear this beeping sound. And it'll take a few seconds and then the prime mover will start up. And it's just like the prototype. I think it's amazing that we've been able to replicate that in N-Scale, with, of course, our partner being ESU. And another thing that was kind of interesting about the CSX rebuilds is the cab. One of the main reasons they upgraded the cabs was crash worthiness. And a lot of rail fans think these cabs look ugly. Personally, I think they're awesome. I think they're unique. When you're sitting trackside and you see one come around a corner, you know exactly what railroad you're on, even if you can't make out the lettering too well. They also added anti-climbers on the front of the locomotives, and that way if there was a head-on collision, the train crew would be much more likely to survive or not sustain injuries during a head-on collision, which is really important. Another thing that's really cool about the CSX locomotives is on the rear end, on the long hood end, they have the electronic brake on a separate stand, which is a really cool detail. CSX, to my knowledge, is the only Class 1 railroad that has that feature. And again, take your magnifying glass, look a little closer, and you can see all of the warning labels are on that brake stand, which is really cool. And a feature on both the CSX and Norfolk Southern versions are front and rear ditch lights. And when you blow the horn, on each end, they actually alternate, just like in real life, which is a feature that until very recently was not possible in N-Scale. And we're really proud to be able to offer that with our partnership with ESU. So me being a Norfolk Southern modeler, I love NS. It's the railroad that I grew up with. Seeing our Admiral cab scaled down is really incredible. I mean, the detail is just mind-blowing to me. Norfolk Southern kind of followed CSX's lead. They were about a year later, they started doing their own rebuilds, and they came up with this unique cab design by Curry Rail Services, and it was called an Admiral cab. And the reason it was called an Admiral cab, and this is a fun fact that I learned from working here at Scale Trains, is because there was an admiral, a Navy admiral, who worked with NS, who was on the board of directors, and he spent a lot of time sailing across the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the things that he noticed when he was on those ships is that the windows on the bridge were always slanted forward, and that was to prevent glare. So, if you're looking at your laptop screen and you've got lights up on the ceiling, you're like, man, I can't see my screen. If you just tilt your screen a little forward, you don't have that glare problem, and it's the exact same thing with these Admiral cab locomotives. A lot like CSX, the cabs were designed for crash worthiness. There was a lot more steel involved, so the crew was a lot more protected in the event of a head-on collision. Norfolk Southern had front and rear anti-climbers. Some of the locomotives had electronic brakes. Others still had the brake wheel. I believe this one in particular had the brake wheel. It does have the brake wheel. I can see it there. And of course, the horn placement being in the middle of the long hood. CSX did the exact same thing. This one is also a K5LA, like how we talked about earlier on the chassis system. Norfolk Southern, as I mentioned, front and rear flashing ditch lights. These Admiral cabs, the first ones, were rebuilt Southern Railway high hoods. So these two locomotives here on the far left, that's how they looked as delivered for Southern Railway. They eventually joined Norfolk Southern in 1982. They were repainted. They retained their high short hood until the early 2010s. And gradually, as Norfolk Southern started rebuilding these units, they were set up to run short hood forward. And that's one of the cool things. So my great-grandfather worked for Southern Railway, and these two locomotives here on my far left, I took them out of the box last week, set them on the test track, and I was just blown away. Incredible sound quality, detail. Southern Railway modelers, you'll really appreciate this. The walkway lights are actually on the side of the locomotive. They're not functioning. Like I said earlier, there's limitations to N-scale, but the walkway lights are there. It's a small brass part. You've got your tread plate detail. You've got your firecracker antennas. We were talking earlier about horns. On this version of the locomotive, you have a P3 air horn. On this one, you have a P5 air horn, which is really cool. They sound different, and that's one of the things too. Railroad road number and era-specific detail, it goes beyond physical details. You know, when you pull a locomotive out of the box, you shouldn't have to do any modification, and if you do, it should be very minimal, like custom horns or things like that. We've taken a lot of the work out of that. These locomotives are set up to run long hood forward. They're facing short hood forward here in the video, but they're actually designed to run backwards, just like the prototypes, which is a really cool detail. Another thing that's kind of interesting, there's two different paint scheme variations for Southern. This is the earlier version, the gold paint scheme with the gold stripe on the side. This is the later paint scheme that has the Deluxe yellow, as I call it. The Deluxe scheme was adopted in 1979, and the last order of Southern SD40-2s were dressed in that paint scheme. And in real life, the yellow and the logos were reflective. So at night, if you're coming up against a grade crossing and a rural crossing without bells or lights, the locomotives would reflect so you could see the train better in the evening, which I think is a really cool detail. One more detail I wanted to point out about the Southerns is that this particular road number has the electrical conduit for Locotrol. Southern Railway was kind of an innovator in that way. They used radio control so that they could have mid-train units. It's something that they developed in the 60s. This particular locomotive was never retrofitted with Locotrol. It had all the equipment except for in the high short hood. They did not have Locotrol installed. They had the antennas, they had the electrical conduit, but they didn't have Locotrol installed. This firecracker antenna right here is the Locotrol antenna. Last thing I want to mention about N-scale, the cabs all have interiors. On these locomotives here, the control stand is on the right side, and on these, on my left, they are on the left side. And it's amazing, like I said, these locomotives have just completely blown my mind. When you see the level of detail, when you see the paint scheme accuracy, the little warning labels. Another thing I forgot to point out, on all of these locomotives, and we'll show you a close-up picture, if you look behind the fuel tank, behind where the fuel fillers are, you can actually see all of the electrical conduit running along the frame of the locomotive, which I think that's probably my favorite detail on these locomotives because it's so small. But we really wanted to make essentially HO scale into N scale, and I think that's really what we've done. And I'm proud of these locomotives. I'm proud of our product development team. The hours of research that these guys do to make these locomotives, it's truly impressive. The photos that they comb through to find, if we can't find photos of a locomotive on each side, we're not going to make it because we don't do any guesswork here at Scale Trains. And I just can't say enough good things about our product development team. You guys should be really, really proud of these locomotives. So, if you're watching this video and your mind is as blown as mine is, you better act now and order these locomotives. They're in stock now. Burlington Northern is almost completely sold out. There's a couple other road names like Union Pacific that's starting to get low on inventory. So if you want these road names, we recommend ordering now. We also have the second run on pre-order, which are set to arrive later this year. I highly recommend going and pre-ordering them because they're probably not going to last long. We've heard so many great things from other modelers who were like, yeah, I have 6 or 7 SD40-2s from other manufacturers. I don't really need one. And then they put their friend comes over, they put one of these on their layout and they're like, oh my gosh, I have to have one. So I recommend pre-ordering now so you don't miss out, and also ordering these in-stock models today. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining us here Make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Same thing on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button. Ring the bell for notifications, and we'll see you next time here on the Scale Trains YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.